Welcome back, everybody, to Sia Nejad Sports. Really good episode today. I can't wait to talk to this man. We got another episode tomorrow, another guest tomorrow. We're coming off a great show. It's none other today than Femi Abebefe. Femi, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. I know you approached me about doing this about a month or so ago, and I didn't really know what the show was about. I listened to a couple of the episodes, and the episode with Chris Cody, and then
Yeah.
also Pamela Maldonado, who also works in the betting space. So I'm
hmm
fired up beyond, man. Honored that you'd have me on the show.
That's great. And just out of curiosity, by the way, Pamela was great on this show. For those of you that didn't see that show, please go back and listen to it. And she helped me. Honestly, she didn't help me. She got Daniel Negreanu, who was one of our guests, and he was really, really interesting. I think a lot of people, some of the guests on my show, they put certain people in a box, like, oh, Daniel's just going to talk about poker. Man, he had a lot
Mhm.
of like really good life skills and just sort of habits and motivation to address. So I encourage everybody to go back and listen to every episode. Femi, I'm glad you listened to that. You mentioned Chris Cody.
Yeah.
Are you a Cody fan? Are you a Levitard fan? What's the
I
background
am.
there?
I haven't been caught up as much on the Levitard show recently since I've been busy with work and all that stuff. But big Levitard fan going back to when they're back on ESPN and all that stuff. I love the shipping container and obviously
Yes.
Dan Stugatz, like the whole crew. I know they've grown since then, but yeah, no, their show is awesome, and I think a lot of shows try to emulate what they do because they're probably the best in my opinion. But yeah, no, big Levitard show fan from back in the day.
There's something about that show that I think fits nicely into the Sia Nejad Sports thing, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, but
Mhm.
it's the idea of kind of being creative and being who you are and not following the same format that everybody else is following. And for me, on Sia Nejad Sports, one thing I preach, Femi, is to be different, unless you're just being artificially different, but to kind of set yourself apart. And honestly, that's kind of where I want to start with you.
Mhm.
First of all, just a little bit of background. Femi, I know you're on the GM Shuffle. You're a host on VSiN. Is that the main places people can find you? And also, that's not where you started. Can you tell us where you started?
Yeah. So right now, like you mentioned, I'm a host slash analyst, but mainly a host over at VSiN. It's Vegas Stats and Information Network. It's the first kind of 24/7 network that was dedicated to sports betting, launched back in 2017. I was just been lucky enough to be here since 2021. So it's been a couple years now down here in Vegas. But I also, like you mentioned, co-host the GM Shuffle podcast with Michael Lombardi. He was a former front office executive in the NFL. I mean, worked with Bill Walsh, Al Davis, worked closely with Bill Belichick. Like those are some of the pillar names when you talk about the National Football League. And I'm lucky enough to do the podcast with him where we talk all things NFL all year round and talk about a little other stuff as well. He's a big Sopranos fan. I've been catching up on the Sopranos. So that's been really cool to do that podcast. Been doing that for a little more than a year, but it's been a long journey to get here, Sia. I mean, I started out, I think dating back to probably high school was when I knew I wanted to do something in sports because I played sports growing up, like most kids, played football. Earlier I had played soccer and basketball, but in high school it was mainly football. And I threw discus and track just to kind of stay in shape and give me something to do until football season came around in the summer and the fall. But I knew that I was not going to be an NFL player growing up. I played on the offensive and defensive line, and I'm not 6'5", nor am I
Mhm.
315 pounds and run sub 4.5 in the 40s. So I knew very quickly that, all right, I'm not going to be a professional athlete, but how can I still kind of be around sports? How can I still have a job to where I wake up and I'm actively encouraged and want to go to that job and not just kind of sit at a 9 to 5. And no offense to anybody who does that. There's a lot of jobs that are 9 to 5 that people love, but I just knew that wasn't going to be for me. So I knew that I wanted to kind of get in sports, and I figured, all right, what's the best way to do that? And I thought, all right, journalism. You can cover games, go to all the games, report on the stories of all the players and the teams or whatever, and that would be a way to kind of still be around sports while having it be my job. And I did that. I went to Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington, which is about 90 minutes north of Seattle. So it's pretty close to the Washington and Canada border there.
Mhm.
So Vancouver was about a 90-minute drive or so from Bellingham, since it's a little north once you get into British Columbia. But I went to school there 4 years, majored in journalism, and actually my focus was in public relations in my
Mm.
journalism degree there. So it was kind of weird. Like I didn't really see myself as a PR guy. Like I didn't know what path I wanted to take in journalism, but I was like, hey, you know what? Newspapers are kind of slowly, not dying, but the market wasn't looking great. And I knew I didn't want to do environmental journalism and all that. So I was like, all right, well, let's do public relations and see kind of how this works out. And probably halfway through the program, I was like, you know what? I kind of like this, but I'm not really in love with it. I'm not super passionate about this. So I decided to sort of pivot. And luckily, like we would get all the emails as people that in the journalism and communications programs, they would send out just like the listservs of all the internships and all that stuff. And most of the time I kind of just glance at them, then delete them just because it was like, all right, this is just kind of feels like junk mail, just getting random stuff here every day. But there was one that really stood out to me, and it was with a local nonprofit video production company in Bellingham, and it was called Black Dog Productions, but then they changed the name to Center for New Media, and it was much different than anything that I'd done in my actual academic program, because at Western Washington we didn't have a broadcast journalism program. It was environmental, it was the PR, and then like the news editorial. So there was no like, hey, you want to be on TV, here's the path to do it here. So I went ahead and did that internship without getting any credit for it. It was just like as an aside. And I learned how to shoot video, edit video, be on camera, be behind camera. And that's kind of how I started off in my broadcast career. And I did that for about the last 2 years of my academic career at Western Washington University. And through that, I was able to do play-by-play for high school basketball. And I also did a sports show. It was like a weekly sports show that we had covering our school sports and also the community college that was in the area as well. And I was able to make a reel from those 2 years. And that's kind of how I got my kickstart into broadcast journalism. That reel still exists on YouTube somewhere. And
I've seen it.
Yeah, every time I watch
it, it's like a 7-minute reel, right?
I'm petrified when I watch it, just because I'm so interesting, so green.
You know what's interesting, Femi? And I'll be honest, I didn't watch the entire reel. I was kind of just scanning through different portions. You were really good. Like, and I say it like that because you were still green at that time. You're just putting the reel together. You don't have maybe as much of the experience as you do now. I stopped in luckily on the Kobe Bryant part, which obviously you authored or you broadcasted something, what looked to be like as an anchor right after his death. And it was just so well done. And I looked at that and I was thinking, man, if Kobe were watching this, or any fan of Kobe or his family, like you just captured the moment and his career and his life. I thought you did really well with that. I'm curious about the sizzle reel because one thing you said that you did that I think even me, like I don't know how to do stuff like this, but you said you learned sort of the tech side. You learned how to edit video and things of that nature. I'm curious, how long did that take you? What was that process like? Because I can tell you what's holding a lot of people back from, whether it's inside or outside the career of like sports or broadcasting, whatever it is, video editing and things of that nature. It's very daunting. Like to this day, It's not something, I can do stuff on my iPhone and whatnot with some apps, but I'm just curious, how painstaking was that? Because I feel like you taking that step, you were able to sort of graduate to a level where you're like, okay, now I can put my stuff on a platform and actually have people see it. That's a really big step that I feel like a lot of people don't take because it's intimidating. What was that process like?
Oh man, it's a grind. Like you mentioned, like video editing, it's a long, arduous process. And I'll use a local news example of it. Let's say you go out and you do a story and you're on like a 30-minute shoot. Well, you might edit that story that's going to be about 90 seconds to 2 minutes, and it might take you 2.5 hours to edit it. Like just putting everything together and making sure that your track matches up with the video and the video's matching up with what you're saying. It's a very, very long process. And it started luckily back when I was in college. I was able to kind of learn it very, very much on the amateur side. And then when I got to Bend, Oregon, which was my first job in local news, this was about September 2013 when I got that job. And that's when I was luckily able to be trained by our photographers that we had here, the photographers in a newsroom are the ones that usually shoot the video and they'll edit the video. But now with cutbacks and all that stuff, like as a reporter, you have to shoot and edit and also do like your live shot and all that stuff. They call them MMJs, like multimedia journalists, because like you're kind of doing everything. Yeah. And it's like you kind of have to learn, and either you're going to swim or you're going to drown. And luckily I had people that really taught me how to do it, and you'll make mistakes along the way and learn some tricks here and there. But I actually felt that once I learned how to edit, I actually became a better shooter because I knew what to kind of look for. So like when you go through the first process, you shoot some video, then you come back and edit it, and you're just like, oh, like this is not very good. Like, like you kind of go through like this video, I have no transitions, I have no here, like that, like, or the audio is really bad. So it actually helped me become a better shooter by editing. And then like, kind of vice versa there. So it allowed me to kind of learn those tricks of the trade, but it was very, very long process. And even now, I mean, I haven't edited video in quite some time. It's been about 5 years or so, other than like putting a couple clips together for like a reel that you mentioned there. But like actually editing a video and adding some like cool graphics on it and stuff like that. Like, I mean, even now I'm probably still like at the amateurish level. Like I can do it, but it's not going to be something that's like, oh my God, this is like the greatest edited video or anything like that. Like it's still a learning process. And there are people who are professional editors. I will tell you, they learn things still after doing it 20, 25 years till this day, learning because there's always new technology and there's new ways to kind of show things and make things appealing.
Yeah, totally understand that. I'm curious, another thing you said that was interesting to me. Now, you went to school, you were thinking about journalism, and it sounded like you were doing some PR stuff because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the state of journalism, I don't know that these were your words, but was kind of dying or sort of getting lost a little
100%.
bit. Yeah,
Yep.
so I'm curious because you now are not a journalist per se, but like you're sort of in that realm. I'm wondering, when you were in school, when you were in college in Washington, did you get to a point where you thought, well, maybe whether it's PR or journalism or media, maybe this isn't the time for me. Maybe I missed my window. Did that conversation ever happen to yourself? And how did you sort of persevere through that? Because it is a tough industry. It is saturated. And a lot of different pieces of this industry have shrunk since, let's say, 10 years ago.
I wouldn't say it really dawned on me as like the industry as a whole, but certain aspects of the industry definitely did. And even when I was a high school student, I was lucky to do like our senior project was like, hey, like do something on your senior project that like you would want to do later on in life. And the thing that I had my focus was like learning how to be a sports writer. So I literally got to shadow a sports writer at our local newspaper as he kind of covered a hockey game or a college basketball game. And like he helped me come along and like I would go ahead and do stuff with him just to kind of see what it's like. And through conversations with him, this is even before I even got to college, he told me straight up, he's like, yeah, you're not going to make a whole lot of money in this gig, man. Like, it's just like just FYI. And like, I was glad, like, luckily he was a straight shooter with me. He didn't try to like kind of like gloss over anything or try to like, sugarcoat it and be like, hey, yeah, this is the greatest thing ever. Like journalism is obviously really important. It's sad that oftentimes you're not going to make a whole lot of money, especially when you're on the kind of the local level and you're on the ground floor there. But he was honest and said, yeah, like as a sports journalist, you're probably going to make coming out of college mid 20,000 per year. And I was just like, whoa, that's not a lot of money, especially after going to college. So it kind of got the gears turning that once I got to college, I was like, all right, I kind of see where the landscape of like print journalism is going. Everything's kind of going online and it's not less glorified, but it's just kind of more on a smaller scale because media was changing. Like media is changing all the time. Like, like we're able to now do this like miles and miles away, thousands of miles away versus in the past where it's like, hey, this would not be possible. Like the landscape is always changing. So I was like, how can I adapt with the landscape? And that's when I was kind of, all right, well, I don't know if I want to do print journalism. And I have friends who do print journalism. They do terrific jobs, but I know I was like, I don't want to really do that because it's going to be very, very low paying early on. And I don't know what the ceiling is in terms of what I can make and all that. I'm not just someone who's just driven on money, but I mean, you can't pay the bills on passion,
Right,
like,
exactly.
Passion alone is not going to do it. Like you actually have to have the finances to do that stuff. So I was like, all right, where else can I go? And I kind of researched public relations. I was like, all right, I make a little bit more money there. Not like the greatest, but okay, let me try that out and see if I would like it. And I tried it out, kind of liked it, didn't love it, like I said. And I was like, all right, well, where else can I pivot? And then that was to broadcast journalism, where then I finally learned that you also don't make a whole lot of money starting out either. But
right.
but it was something that I could tell that I was really passionate about, and I actually believed in myself to where it's like, okay, I get it. Let me get my foot in the door. I know I'm not going to make a whole lot of money right away, but there's always that chance to get more money because everybody watches TV and all that stuff. Like those people make a ton of money who are on all the big networks. So I was like, maybe I could get to that level to where this would pay off in the long haul.
Yeah, and I think one lesson I'd like to think I'm learning, because I've bounced around careers, Femi. I was an attorney. I still am an attorney. I just don't practice anymore. Then I did pharma sales, and then I just went full bore into media. And I think one thing I'm certain of is that if you're really passionate about something, It doesn't mean you're going to be rich at the end of it. But if you're really passionate about something, you are going to set yourself apart from not everybody else, but most other people. And you're going to put yourself in an echelon where you are going to command a certain amount of money that perhaps is greater than some of the people who aren't as passionate as you are. And it actually brings me to a question, because I saw in an interview you did some time ago that you mentioned, this is back in the day a little bit, probably 5-10 years ago, you wanted to make yourself more versatile. And really how I read that is just making yourself more marketable in broadcast journalism, in just media and whatnot. And I think that's a problem a lot of people have. At Sia Nejad Sports, we're trying to inspire people to kind of like accomplish their goals, to tackle their goals. And it's easy to say that, but from a practical standpoint, I'm trying to provide the tools of like, hey, these are the steps and these are the things you can do. But I'm just curious, in your experience, how did you actually make yourself more versatile? How did you make yourself more marketable? Was it just flooding the market with your sizzle reel? Because I know you sent it out to a bunch of places, but how did you add value?
Yeah, well, definitely after I graduated college, I had no idea what the hell I was doing. So I was sending it out to hundreds and hundreds of different places trying to find jobs. I mean, places where I was in no way qualified for those jobs, but you kind of live and you learn. And I was able to get on the right path. And my first job, I really honestly like credit my first news director, who was like the direct manager when you're in the newsroom, Lee Anderson in Bend, Oregon. Is KTVZ is the station. And the cool thing that he did was when we got in, obviously we didn't make a whole lot of money and stuff like that. We were all pretty green, had no idea what we were doing, but he allowed everyone to kind of try a little bit of everything. Like, like he allowed, like I always say, like in local news, I've literally done everything except for doing the weather. Like I never got a chance to do the weather. It's probably smart that they never put me up there to do the weather and all that stuff, but I produced a newscast. I've been the news anchor. I've been the sports anchor. I've been a reporter. I've been a photographer. Like I was able to kind of dabble in everything. And it allowed me to kind of see what I wanted to do on that start. So that was kind of cool. It's like, okay, I like this, I don't like that, or I really love this and I really hate that. But then it also kind of gave me the tricks of the trade for every single like position. So I was like, okay, I can produce something. I can be a news reporter. I can be a sports reporter. I can be a news anchor. I can I didn't do everything at a high level, but I at least had the chance to do it so that I had that sort of experience to where when I put on a resume, I can say I've done X, Y, Z, and also A, B, and C. That at least makes you a little bit more versatile and a little bit more marketable, because especially in local news, the industry is shrinking. Like, newsrooms are shrinking. They're trying to find people who can do everything. You can't really be a one-trick pony anymore. You can't just be, I'm dressed in news anchor, I can't report, I can't shoot. Like that doesn't fly really. Like at the bigger markets, maybe it does, but once you try to go from smaller markets to medium-sized markets, it's tough to get a job that way. So being as versatile as possible, and I'm sure it translates to other industries as well, I think is a really, really big key there. Like it's not like you don't really want to be the jack of all trades and the master of none, but you want to be able to kind of know a little bit of everything and also hone in on what you like to do, because then that's when you can figure out what you ultimately want to do and become really good at that. So I think that was really helpful for me in my career, just being able to get that start in Bend, where I know a lot of people got their starts in broadcast where they were kind of shoehorned into one spot, and it's hard to kind of get out of that once you kind of get quote unquote typecast or something like that.
One thing I like about the versatility thing too is that it's not only providing you the tools to be better across so many different facets and to build your resume, frankly, but it's also telling your employer, I'm going to say yes to things that are going to make this production better. And I think there's so much value there, whether you stay at your job or you end up leaving, you know, and that can be via recommendations from your boss. But I think the bottom line is, if you're willing to say yes to everything, not within reason, of course, and you are going to be like just the jack of all trades to some degree, then they're going to keep you around, but it just makes you so much more marketable. And I think when it comes to the idea of adding value, like how does this person, random person not you, but just any random person add value? Just being able to say yes to everything and saying like, I'm going to help, I'm going to be there for you when this fails or when you need this. That's separating yourself, because not everybody does that. Femi, I think maybe you've worked with people like this where, they're just there to do their job. And what it looks like is they're there to do their job and collect their paycheck. And then there's the people like yourself, and I'd like to think I'm like this, where I'm going the extra mile, but it's not necessarily that I'm volunteering for different things. It's like, hey, when there's an issue, I want to be there. I want you to be able to lean on me when somebody's out or whatever the case may be. Do you find that personality trait important in terms of like what you've done and what you've accomplished?
I think it's really important. It's something that I still do to this day. Like, like some people might say, oh, he's got a really great job at VSiN and he hosts a podcast, so he can kind of pick and choose. Till this day, like I just filled in on a show here at VSiN about 2 hours ago, just because we were a little bit short staffed. And I think saying yes, it opens your eyes to things that you might not have seen prior. Like you might understand, oh, wow, like I would have never have done this because it's not my originally scheduled shift, or it's not something that they originally thought for me. But now that I did it, this is really cool. Like I always want to make myself available and accountable. I think are two things that really, really go far in any sort of industry, and they translate to anything, whether it's sports, whether it's you're in the tech industry, or if you're in the medical industry. Like just being accountable and being available, people really appreciate that because they know that they can go to you in those moments of crisis of like, okay, hey, we have a little bit of adversity. So-and-so is sick. All right, well, who can we call? Well, this person, they're always kind of a pain in the butt to kind of call them. So let's not call them. Let's call this person because they're always willing to kind of help out. And I like to be the person that's always willing to help out, because not only does it put you in good standing with your bosses, but it also allows you to do opportunities and things that you just might not have been able to do because, you weren't scheduled to do that. So I definitely have experience working with people who were not like that. And cashing a check is the first thing that came to my mind when you said that. So I'm glad you said it as well. Cause I'm like, some people just show up to collect the check, and hey, you know what? God bless you. If that's what you want to do and you really don't have any sort of aspirations to try to dream bigger or strive for more, that's fine too. Like not everybody has to be that way and all that, but I know that's just kind of how I am, because that's kind of how I was raised, and it was always like, all right, like try to be the best that you can be. So I try to do that, just being helpful and trying to do the best of my job, or trying to do the best to my ability, or at least at my job.
It's interesting because the people who are there just to collect a paycheck, I'm not like casting dispersions on those people. In other words, you're not doing anything wrong if that's what you're doing. But if you are the person that's maybe complaining to yourself or to others that, hey, things aren't falling right for me, or I just can't seem to get to the next level in this job or in this, whatever, it could be social or otherwise, going that extra mile and being, I love what you said, available and accountable. Like that's really important. And that's how you set yourself apart from the paycheck person, which again, there's nothing wrong with paycheck person, but that's just your everyday worker. That's just your everyday guy or girl. And just, I think setting yourself apart, it's easy for me to say, hey, be creative, be different. And I support all of those ideas, but sometimes it's as simple as being accountable and available, like Femi said. Speaking of availability, Femi, so I don't know how many times in your career you've met adversity, but I do know just from knowing your career that you did meet adversity at least one time. And if you want to speak to other times, that's great. But I know when you were working at, and forgive me if I get the name wrong here, Sinclair, Como, that's where you were, as far as I know, an anchor/sports anchor, and they had cutbacks, and you had a lot of a big following there. I know that because you authored a tweet after those cutbacks. I thought the tweet was really interesting, but just to set up the scenario, you were at Sinclair for how many years, and what ended up happening there?
So, I mean, in local news, I think one of my dreams and one of, I guess, my bucket list things to do when I joined the industry was, all right, at some point in my career, I want to work in my home market. And I grew up about 25 minutes north of Seattle, watched Seattle local news like as a kid. So like I can remember like all like the kind of the anchors that we'd hold in high esteem of just like, hey, like those, like I remember seeing that person, and now I work side by side with them. This is pretty cool. So when my contract was coming close to expiring in Spokane, which was my second job, I was able to right place, right time, get the job in Seattle as the weekend sports anchor. And I got there in August of 2019, and everything was going great. It was a really rewarding experience. I mean, I was getting people that were reaching out to me because I had been gone for about 6 years, finally came back home. I mean, I remember like one of my elementary school teachers, she reached out to me on Facebook. I had friends from college, and like they're saying, hey, my parents saw you on the news and all this stuff, which was really, it was so rewarding. Like more so than just being able to say I worked at my home station. Like that part was probably like one of like my favorite parts of working in this industry as a whole, was like getting those messages. It felt like probably once every month or so, because it was like, wow, like this was like a really cool experience. And this is what I wanted coming back home, to have the people who support me and know me the best actually get to see what I do. Cause they all knew that, hey, Femi went down to Oregon to go work and do a local news job, or, oh, he's in Spokane. But it's like, now that they can actually see my work, that was a really rewarding experience. And it was going really great. Obviously, August 2019, we do football season covering the Seahawks. They were a really good team. And everything goes into 2020 where it's like, okay, like all right, now gearing up for baseball season, we go down to spring training, and then we come back from spring training from baseball, and then COVID hits.
Mhm.
And when COVID hits, it's like, okay, things slow down, obviously, on the sports side, and we have to get creative about how we're going to cover sports. And that time was really stressful for me. I'm somebody who doesn't really get stressed out often, but that was a really, really stressful time in my life because I was like, okay, well, sports went away. Is my job going to go away? Are they going to keep me around? How can I stay relevant here at work to where they feel like I'm an asset and don't just like cut me because, hey, it's coronavirus. We got to cut back on stuff.
Yeah.
You're gone. And luckily, I was able to make it all the way through 2020. As we all know, sports came back like around June, July, and we were able to have a football season. I mean, we had like the baseball season. It was a condensed form, but we had a baseball season. And I was like, man, I think I kind of made it through, like I think we got through this like rough patch, and now here we go. Like things are gonna like start opening up again, like the vaccines and all that stuff. Like we thought we were kind of through the dark times. So now fast forward to March 2021. And we didn't go down to spring training because there was still some travel restrictions within Sinclair and all that stuff. So kind of covering it from home and all that. I was like, okay, like baseball season is going to, opening day is about a month away. NFL, they're going to be full stadiums once again. So it's going to all feel like 2019. And then I get an email from my news director at Como. And it said, hey, we have a meeting with you on Microsoft Teams because I was working from home this day, luckily. They said, we have a meeting, Microsoft Teams. It's me. It's going to be our general manager and HR. And I'm like,
HR.
What? Yeah, I'm like, that's strange. And I was thinking to myself, like, what could this possibly be about? Like, did I forget to do like my COVID check thing or whatever? Because we had like do these daily, like, hey, are you having any symptoms or whatever?
That's right. Make sure that I've seen those. Yep.
So I was like, did I forget to do that? Like, or did I tweet something crazy or something like that? Like, so I'm scrolling through my Twitter. I'm like, okay, I don't think I tweet anything that would like make them want to fire me. Like, what's going on? And I'm like, okay, this is a little strange. And I was like, all right, well, I guess I have a meeting at 3:00 and I'll just wait until then while I'm covering this Mariners game from afar. And I'm scrolling Twitter. And then I see on FTV Live, it's like a gossip column for local news and a little bit of national news, but it's mainly like a local news gossip column. And I followed them on Twitter just because it's just stay in the know on what's going on in the industry. And I see on FTV Live, breaking news, Sinclair making cuts. Ooh. And I'm like, oh God, like what is going on? And I see that, and I text my news director, and I sent him the link to that tweet, and I said, hey man, is this just a coincidence or what is this meeting about later this afternoon? He's like, I'm not at liberty to say what the meeting is about. We're meeting at 3:00. And I texted him again. I said, hey buddy, we have a good relationship, man. Like, I don't want to be blindsided. So like, just tell me straight up, like, what is this meeting about? And he said, I'm not at liberty to say. Damn. And that's when I knew. I'm like, okay, I think I'm screwed. And then the meeting happens. It's the general manager and then the HR and all that stuff. And they're telling me like, hey, like, we're going to have to let you go and all that stuff. Like, there's other people we're letting go, but, we just can't budget it right now. Like, Sinclair needed to make some cutbacks. Unfortunately, it's not a performance thing. And we just have to we have to let you go. I said, like, it was like probably like an 8-minute meeting or so. They were talking. I said nothing the entire time. Mm-hmm. I was like, I was pissed. Like, I was just like, what the hell's going on? And I knew, I was like, I want to be able to collect my thoughts. So I'm not going to say anything because I might say something outlandish. And thank God I'm sitting in my living room and not having to go into work and they tell me this in person because I don't know what would have happened. Mm-hmm. Like I might have thrown a stapler or something. Who knows what happened? So we can laugh on it now, but it wasn't funny back then. But I kind of sit there and I don't say anything. And about an hour later, I call my news director. I'm like, hey, like, what the hell happened? Like pretty much like WTF, man. Like how that, like, this is like a blindside. And like, he was telling me, he's like, hey man, I obviously, like, I love, like he hired me, like, he was one of his first hires. So I'm just like, kind of like confused by the whole thing. And he once again said like, hey, this is not like performance based. Like if there's anything I can do to help out and all that stuff. And I'm just like, dude, this is just crappy. Because not only am I getting laid off, I'm getting laid off in my home market to where it's like, part of me felt a little bit embarrassed and like, just naturally, I'm like, everybody was watching me and all that stuff. And then it's like, oh, actually, I no longer have a job. They just let me go. And I'd been there for about a year and a half. So now I'm thinking, like, what am I going to do? Like, what's my next move? Do I want to stay here in Seattle? And it really was like, you mentioned like adversity. Like that was one of the most adverse times in my life because I'd never gone through that. Because I mean, I've only been in this industry for about a decade now, and I was like, man, like this sucks. And like I know it happened, but I just didn't think it would happen to me.
So I want to get to the tweet you authored because I think there's a couple lines in there that I just really, really liked and that I think are sort of
Mhm.
representative of what the Sia Nejad Sports show is supposed to be about. But I'm curious in that moment, clearly in that moment, you're feeling frustration and you mentioned embarrassment, a lot of different emotions. Um, After you collected your thoughts, I'm assuming within an hour or at least 24 hours, you thought to yourself, okay, what's the next step? What do I do now? I'm just curious where your mind went when it came to the next step, because I think it might be helpful to people who also have met that HR call and are just kind of wallowing in their own self-pity at the moment, but they know at some point they need to take a step forward.
You're giving me too much credit. It took a little bit longer than 24 hours.
Fair enough.
It was, I think I got laid off. I believe it was a Thursday. And I was like, all right, I'm just going to take the weekend, clear my
Mhm.
head. Like I talked to my family. So like my family knew about it and stuff like that. But I was like, obviously I hadn't like tweeted anything about it. So nobody like in the public really knew, or none of my friends even knew. It was just me, my girlfriend at the time, who's not my fiance, but she was my girlfriend at the time. I told her, and like she actually like, because she worked in local news as well. She was a producer at the
Mm.
NBC station because Como's the ABC. She was at the NBC station, King 5. And like obviously, like their newsroom was talking when they see the tweets and all that stuff. Like, oh my God, like who's gonna get laid off and all blah 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 blah. And like word travels quick. I mean, like it's a 2-degree separation in the local news industry. Like,
Yeah.
like everybody knows everyone,
Mhm.
which can be good and bad, but everybody knows everybody. And like she's texting me, she's like, hey, like, are you okay? Like, do they like, do you have a job? Essentially, is what she's texting me because she saw the tweets. And like, and I didn't text her back because I didn't want her to worry about me and like kind of freak out. And I think I waited about a few hours because she was at work already and I was just sitting at home. And I waited a few hours and I finally let her know. And I was like, hey, yeah, I am one of the layoffs. Like, like, and then like, she's like, we're talking on the phone. She's breaking down at work. She ends up leaving work early because she's like, hey, like, I just want to be with you. Like, I'm just going to come home now and we'll talk about it and stuff. And like, I just took like, honestly, the weekend just to clear my head. One of my buddies from Bend was actually in town coincidentally. So like, I hung out with him and his wife and all that. And like, and he worked at a Sinclair station. He didn't get laid off, but at the time he was working at the Portland station at Sinclair. And we kind of talked about it and all that stuff. And we had shared stories about Sinclair in the past and all that. So he was good. He was probably the perfect person to talk to and talk to my brother and like my family and all that. And then after taking a weekend about it or just kind of reflect and think about things was when I really was like, all right, what's next?
Mhm.
And before I put out what's next, I was like, all right, I got to put out there that I'm available and I no longer have a job so that, employers can kind of see that, oh, here's somebody who's had experience working at a top 15 market as a weekend sports taker. Let's give them a call and see if we have an opening. So I craft that message or type it out there and stuff. And like, it was like a thoughtful message. And I
Mhm.
kind of wanted to get across. It's like, hey, like, like this is obviously disappointing, but like uncertainties never really phased me. And I'm fine to see what happens going forward. I've never really been somebody who's been on the open market, quote unquote. So let's see what's out there. And I'm going to be picky and I'm curious to see where this thing lands. So it was just kind of a message of just trying to keep my head up and almost like motivate myself in a sense to just not get down in the dumps. And that was one thing that I think I was able to do was I never really got like super down on myself during that time period. And I think it started from that message of saying, all right, like this sucks, but you're not the first person to ever get laid off. You're not going to be the
Mhm.
last person to ever get laid off. Wear it off after a few days and then just kind of go from there and see what's out there. And that's sort of what I did.
Isn't it so two things I pulled from that tweet. One was, and you just encapsulated them. One, you said, and I quote, uncertainty has never scared me. And you
Mm-hmm.
also said in a different area of the tweet, I continued to stay positive. I wonder, first of all, positivity is just on every show it comes up. If you are a positive person, whether you stay positive internally is one thing, but if you're just a positive person in general, opportunities are going to come your way because people naturally, whether they realize it or not, gravitate to that positivity. But on the uncertainty part, Femi, I'm curious, the fact that uncertainty didn't scare you, uncertainty hasn't scared me in the past either. And I'm wondering if it's because you believed in yourself so much. You believed in your skill set, you believed in what you can bring to the table. And therefore, even though it was uncertain times, you knew you were marketable enough to land somewhere where you wanted to be. Is that part of it?
100%. That's 100%. And it comes from a self-belief that I have my parents to thank. You know, they were always really supportive of me when I was a child, teenager, young adult, even now. They've always been like my biggest fans, and they've always been like, not like just like saying, oh, you're the best, not like that, but it's like,
Yeah.
hey, like, you know, like you're very talented, like believe in yourself and work hard and see where things go. And that's kind of where that comes from. Like, okay, like I believe in what I've done. Like my work speaks for itself. Like I have a reel, I have clips that are out there, and I believe that I'm an addition to any newsroom in the country. So this sucks right now, but I think that this is going to be something that leads to something else down the line. So that's kind of where that I wasn't really scared that I was going to find a job. It was more so, where am I going to find the job? When am I going to find the job? And what has to happen between now and then? That was kind of like the biggest thing on my mind. But finding a job never really scared me. And it's not to sound like arrogant or cocky or anything like that, but I believed in myself, and I knew that, hey, like, and there's other people out there that when they see my work, they'll believe in me. And I think if I were to get an interview, I can have them see what I'm all about. And then from there on, we can go from there. So I think that's kind of where that really came from and stuff. And like I said, like, it's just, it was kind of a rough time there, but staying positive is something that I've always kind of, I've always kind of had that as a moniker. Cause I'm like, you know what, if I get negative about this, what's going to change? Like,
Right.
you know, like if I get negative and like talk negative and then badmouth everybody or badmouth the station or something like that, like they're not going to give me my job back. You know,
Right.
the
There's
decision's
no
been
upside.
made. Yeah, there's no
Zero upside to that.
there's zero upside. So it's like, okay, take it on the chin, remain positive, and kind of almost like be coaching yourself along the way to get out of it, because there always is a way out. And one thing that happened, like as I got laid off, people said, hey, you know, like one door closes, another one opens, all the cliches. Like this is just a minor setback for a major comeback, you know, like like
Yeah.
every single one that you can put on
It's
a
like a
t-shirt.
Vince
Like
Lombardi speech.
yeah, like I
Yeah, we
got
got
all
it.
of
I get it. I'm loud and clear.
like I got all of those, and I'm just like, you know what? That's easy to say because you have a job right now, but I don't have a job. All right, and but the cool part is that it actually came true. You know,
Yeah.
like that's the part that's really cool about it. Because I was like, man, like everyone's talking about like, oh, this is just one door closing, and this is just, you know, this and that, and like, all right, whatever. You kind of roll your eyes at it, but luckily though, it was able to actually come to fruition.
So real quick, I want to just build upon one thing you said, and I understand like your parents' belief in you and always supporting you and kind of instilling that self confidence. But I
Mhm.
think from a practical standpoint, that confidence, yes, it comes from there, obviously, but it also comes from what we talked about earlier, which was you were invested in so many different things to make yourself better. You put the work in during times where nobody was really noticing, and I think that's where people can really pick up something from your experience, particularly with Sinclair, is that you had already readied yourself to be really good before you even got to Sinclair. And you were doing a lot of stuff that most people wouldn't do. And for the record, a lot of stuff that most people didn't even recognize that you did in the first place. But because you had that wealth of knowledge and experience that you just kind of owned yourself, nobody told you to do that. Well, now suddenly you have this self confidence and this faith in yourself that, yeah, of course I'm going to land another job. It's not, in my opinion, Femi, it's not just because you had like a really good support system. And by the way, I think that's a critical part of anybody's success is
Yeah,
having the right people around you. But it's
100%.
also because you weren't the paycheck guy. You were the I'm going to be, to use your words, accountable and available guy. And if you're that guy, then when you meet adversity, you're going to have faith that you're going to overcome it. You just have to put the work in, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think I heard Jason Tatum say it earlier. I think it was during the last series against the Philadelphia 76ers. And they asked him about like, hey, like, how do you have the confidence to continue to shoot after you start 1 for 12 or whatever in the first three
Mhm.
quarters? It was game 6, I believe. He was awful for 3 quarters and they were
Awful.
facing elimination. And then fourth quarter turns it on and just goes nuclear and scores like 20 points in that last period. And he says, you know, it comes from the preparation. Like, you know, like I prepared, so I put the work in, so I'm always going to remain confident. Just because shots aren't falling doesn't mean that I'm going to start to doubt myself. I'm just going
Mm.
to take more shots and try to win this game, and I know that eventually it's going to start to break my way. And that's kind of like where that comes from. Like when you put the work in, you're always going to have a chance. You're always going to be able to battle through anything because you've had that sweat equity to where when you put the work in, you're also not going to give up easily, because you say, hey,
Right.
I've spent too much time, I put too much that I've had invested in this. I'm going to find a way. I'm going to figure something out. So you have that going for you. And also you just kind of inherently pick things up along the way to where you can work yourself out of problems. So, and like, that's kind of where that comes from, like the self-belief. And then also you have to be able to put the work in, because belief alone is not going to carry you far. You know, there's people walking down the street that believe they're the best singer on the planet Earth, but if you've never really sang or found a way to get into a recording booth, it's not going to really come to fruition.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think sometimes people put the work in and they don't think people are watching because people aren't watching. But just by virtue of putting that work in, you are becoming better at your craft. I see Bearded Knowledge in the comments. I believe that's Phil Stifle, who does media himself and is starting to really grow. And that's because presumably he's putting the work in as well. So I got to ask you before we get out of here, I always have a question that I close the show with. But before we get to that, so obviously you're a host on VSiN, which is great. I mean, I mean, I'm a fan of like pretty much everybody on VSiN. Like Matt Brown comes to mind. Gil Alexander's a guy I've been listening to. Yep. We're from the same area of the country too. We're both from that Northern Virginia area. I think Gil is kind of like the GOAT. There's so many guys, Kelly Bidlin, so many guys that I like. Femi, of course, yourself, and Michael Lombardi. So I want to ask you about the GM shuffle, because you're a younger guy. You're younger than me, but you have a wealth of knowledge. But Michael Lombardi has like a wealth of knowledge. Like you boldface, you italicize, you underline wealth when it comes to that. And I'm wondering, when you got on that show, I think it was Adnan who did it prior to you. Was there any level of intimidation, which would be totally understandable? You're doing a football show with this guy that not only knows football from an analysis standpoint, but has been on the inside. I'm just curious what that felt like when it was like, all right, I'm doing this show with Michael Lombardi, who is, by all accounts, just, so good at what he does.
There was an intimidation, but it wasn't with Michael, funny enough, because I had done a VSiN show with Mike. We've only done one show together before we started doing the podcast. It was like a fill-in show the day before Thanksgiving or whatever. Once again, filling in. But it was the day before Thanksgiving, and we did a show together, and it went well. And then I never really did a show with him. And I'd been on the Lombardi line when like as a guest before and all that stuff. So I kind of had a little bit of a relationship with Michael before the podcast. So I wasn't really intimidated by him. The intimidation honestly came from replacing Adnan Virk. Yeah. Like that's kind of where it came from. I was like, oh, like this guy is established. He's on MLB Network. He used to be on ESPN. Like the viewers of the podcast and the listeners, they love him because he and Michael have such a good rapport. And here I am now replacing that to where it's like, how the hell do I keep this thing going? Yeah. And unprompted, really, really cool part of this transition to the podcast was Adnan actually DM'd me. He DM'd me when like the announcement from DraftKings came that I was going to be hosting the podcast with Michael, and said, hey man, like congratulations on hosting the podcast. Like Michael's a great dude. If you ever need anything, just reach out to me. And, I'm always here. I have an open ear and all that stuff. And like that to me, like meant the world to me, because I was like, oh my gosh, like this guy is like an established dude. And here I am trying to get myself to that level, having to replace him. And it really was like, he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to reach out. I had never tweeted at him. I'd never DM'd him or anything. And he didn't know who I was prior to that press release, I'm sure. But for him to take his time to actually do that, I thought was like, it's the coolest thing ever. And it kind of alleviated a little bit of the pressure I was putting on myself of like, okay, I'm now the co-host of the GM Shuffle podcast. Like, don't screw it up. It was like, okay, we can actually have a conversation and be fine and all that stuff. And I can be as a part of the lineage of co-hosts with Michael Lombardi, who there are many of them and they are all really talented in their own ways. I can kind of carve my own niche, and it'll take time, but I'm hoping the listeners will then embrace me, which they have now after a year or so.
Well, I'll tell you, as a listener, I mean, I try to catch it. You guys have 2 episodes every week. Is that accurate?
Yep. Mondays and Thursdays.
And I try to catch, if it's not 2, it's 1. I'm always seeing the tweets out there. If you all that are listening now or later don't have the GM Shuffle as a part of your football repertoire, you're kind of missing out in a big way. So I encourage everybody to do that. But I listened to the show, and honestly, if I'm being honest, when you first started, I was like, oh, this is different. Like this is because everybody has their own style. So it did take maybe a couple episodes of getting used to, but nobody's going to like take the baton and be like the same. The show is going to have like, I suppose, some growing pains. Not that it was bad, but it was just different. So you have to sort of recognize that. But man, Femi, it's a great show. I love it. The only difference between you And Adnan, is that you haven't watched The Sopranos, and I have a secret. I haven't watched The Sopranos yet. I'm like one of the few people like yourself who've only watched like an episode here and there. So when he talks to you about like, hey, you got to catch up, I know how arduous it is because there's a lot of episodes to catch up on. And he's making references. He wants to make references with you, and it's an hour-long show. Where are you in that? How much have you knocked out?
I am at the end of season 4. So I have a couple episodes of season 4. We're about to slow down here with the NBA and NHL Stanley Cup Finals, NBA Finals. So hopefully I will be able to actually get some more Sopranos in while things slow down a little bit. So
how many seasons were there?
It's gone to a screeching halt a little bit once the playoffs got. There's 6 seasons. So okay. we're through. We're more than halfway into it. So it's really good. Like, I'm not slow on this stuff like that just because like I don't like it. It's a really good show. But it's just, I mean, I love sports. Like, so it's hard for me to like sit down when sports are going on and watch The Sopranos. But once things slow down, especially in the summer, like we'll be done by probably the end of June, would be my guess.
That's great. One other question, Seattle related. It's not really truly Seattle related, but this sitcom is a little before your time. I just have to ask because I don't know many people who kind of like grew up in Seattle and have a big part of their life in Seattle, Washington, or Washington at large. The show Frasier. Do you like? Are you familiar with that show? And is it to your knowledge, is it more revered in Seattle than it might be the rest of the country, just because that's where it took place?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I'd be able to answer it because I've actually never seen Frasier. I know what the show is, but I've actually never seen it. And because it gets the spinoff from Cheers, correct? From
Cheers. And to your credit, it's a little before your time. At your age, you wouldn't have necessarily caught Frasier.
Like, it was in syndication and stuff like that when I was growing up. I want to say there was maybe a few episodes when I was like cognizant of things, but it was mainly in syndication and all that. And I just never really watched it just because I was always like a big Fresh Prince of Bel-Air fan growing up, like Will Smith and all that stuff. And like that was like kind of more of my vibe. But I never like Frasier, like Seinfeld. I've never seen Seinfeld. I don't know.
Oh, wow.
Watched Seinfeld. I've never seen that one. But like I've seen Friends, like probably like the second half of Friends. I want to say those series because like those were like I remember like the series finale and all that. I was in school then, so like it was at least I was old enough to catch the back half of that series. But yeah, like, a lot of those old school shows. Like I watched a lot of Fresh Prince as a kid growing up. It's still like probably my favorite show ever for like sitcom, which I guess we don't really get many of those anymore. Everything's now like dramatic and all that stuff. But
we don't.
Yeah, like it's like a lighthearted sitcom, man. We got to start recreating those on network TV.
So side note, Femi, Pat Mayo and I don't know if you're familiar with Pat Mayo, but we created a best sitcom bracket, like March Madness style. Nice. And I basically seeded like what I thought there were some omissions there by accident, but I seeded what I believe to be like the top 64 sitcoms of all time. And Fresh Prince, just so you know, was a 2 seed. Frasier, Friends, and Seinfeld, along with Modern Family, were a 1 seed. So we're still kind of doing the bracket online. We did 4 podcast episodes actually talking about each region and the pros and cons of each sitcom. But the one thing I mentioned about Fresh Prince, at least at my age, and I'm a little older than you, it was the first sitcom that I felt like I owned. In other words, I wasn't necessarily watching it with my family like I was with some other sitcoms like Growing Pains or The Cosby Show or what have you. Fresh Prince, I kind of identified with Will Smith in certain ways. And even like Carlton, and Uncle Phil, one of the best sitcom dads of all time.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Gotta be top 3, top 4 in terms of
I was going to say, he's on the Mount Rushmore of the sitcom dads. Like he's up there.
100%. Anyway, I had to ask the Frasier question because you,
you're good.
Yeah. Joe in here, Fresh Prince got me emotional real hard twice.
Yeah. I mean, the Will's dad episode, how can you not get emotional about that? You know,
Joe, can you tell us what the other, I'm forgetting it. I wonder if it's when like Carlton had to go to the hospital because he took the speed or whatever.
Speed. Yeah.
That's Will Smith and the gun.
Or when Will got shot at the bank? I believe he was pulling out money from the ATM and he got shot.
And then when they got pulled over and had to go to jail, and Will and Carlton sort of had that realization, like, not unfair America kind of deal. By the way, the end of that show with Uncle Phil was unbelievable.
It was really good.
There we go. Joe says when Carlton took the drugs on accident.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, when he took the speed. Yeah.
That's great. Anyway, so let me close with this. I've taken so much of your time, super gracious, and honestly,
no, you're good, man. This
I gotta tell you, Femi. Normally, I'll ask kind of like a token question that really is high impact in terms of, what's some advice you can give to people and things of that nature. But I think you already did it. I really think that like your life experience and that accountable and available part, I really think that is like the big takeaway, especially when you understand that he was able to use that and utilize those two things with adverse moments too, like with when he's meeting adversity with Sinclair and uncertainty with the next job and things of that nature. If you put the time in and you make yourself available and you hold yourself accountable, you're going to be okay in those moments most likely, and you'll have confidence to like take a step forward immediately. You won't have to kind of ready yourself to take a step forward.
Yep.
You already have the tools because you've put the work in. And Femi, that's super important. However, I do have a question for you before we get out of here. I always ask the guests 3 people that you'd like to thank right here, right now, that may have passed on, maybe still alive, that you would say have put you in, whether it's a mindset standpoint or a practical standpoint, put you where you are today. 3 people that from your past or from your present have made you the person that you are right now, and you'd like to thank them for that. Who are those 3 people?
Family aside, because I know sometimes you say no family.
Yeah, family aside, because you mentioned your parents, so I think you would automatically go to mom and dad. So family
100%.
aside, brothers, sisters aside.
Yeah. Okay. So family aside, push family to the side. I would say the 3 people. One of them is one of my college buddies, David McDonald, and college your freshman year, you meet people and like you're just kind of, it's like a whirlwind, especially that first weekend. Like you're away from family, you're going to parties, you're going to the career fair or the student fair stuff and all that stuff. And I met him at a party and we ended up becoming really, really good friends all throughout college. But he had such a really good mindset about being a go-getter and being unafraid to ask what you want and ask and like kind of put the work in and do what you want to do and carry yourself in a manner to which people would gravitate toward you. And I think that like that experience meeting him and being friends with him, and we're still friends to this day, I thought was really, really valuable to me. Like we don't talk as much as we used to because, he has a family now and all that stuff. And like, I'm busy with my job and I'm getting married in April and all. So it's like, we're all busy with different stuff, but he's definitely somebody that I would thank because he kind of gave me that mentality of like, hey, you know what? Like, if you don't ask, you're never going to get what you want. Kind of the squeaky wheel gets the oil type of thing. Closed mouths don't get fed. So you always got to ask and kind of go out there and put yourself out there, because if you don't do that, nobody will ever notice you.
And I want to interrupt you, Femi, because before you get to that second person, because another thing we preach on this show is putting yourself around the right people. And in this case, Femi was kind of by accident. You just kind of like ran into him and you became a friend. You identified with him and all of his principles and whatnot. But if you are at a place in life right now where people are holding you back, you kind of have to be introspective and actually think about it, because sometimes you don't actively think, hey, this person's holding me back. But there are people that are going to be like, you're too old for that, or you can't do that, or they're going to like subtly belittle the goals that you have because they're outside of the parameters of social norms. If you have those people, you don't need to actively say, hey, get out of my life. But you can sort of subtly sweep them away and incorporate some people in your life that are going to motivate you because they are motivating in their own right. So it sounds like your friend was that guy. And I think people really need to pay attention to who they're surrounding themselves with, because even if they don't have a goal in mind, I promise you, if you put yourself around the right people, all of a sudden you'll be goal oriented too. And I just think it's super important. Femi, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, you're good there. I think Jalen Rose always talks about it, the ESPN NBA analyst says, like, do the people around you, do they add and multiply, or do they subtract and divide? Like, I think we can all figure out like the differences between those two things and carry on as such. It's like you want to be able to be around people who are adding and multiplying versus adding or subtracting and dividing there. But the next person that I would thank is one of my mentors still to this day. And I think this is maybe more so on the practical side of things, but a little bit on the mental side of things as well. But his name is John Collette. And he was also a local news sports anchor. And when I was looking for jobs, I just graduated, moved back home. And one of the pieces of advice that I got from another local news anchor was that, hey, you want to reach out to people and try to find a mentor. And through sending my reel out to a bunch of different stations, I also then looked on YouTube and just was kind of scouring all sorts of reels from all over the country. And I stumbled upon his reel. He was working in Tri-Cities at the time, which is a small town in about central East Washington, a small town about 2.5 hours away from Seattle. And the reel starts with him catching a football and singing like a Jason Derulo lyric or whatever. Like he clearly he's like a happy-go-lucky guy. And I was like, oh, like this is somebody who I would be able to like, be friends with, because like I see a little bit of myself in him. Like I'm very positive, very kind of not afraid to make a fool of myself a little bit if I need to or whatever, self-deprecating, I guess is one way to put it. So I reached out to him, and I'd reached out to a bunch of different people whose work I admired just to get like, hey, like, what do you think about my reel? And this is the reel from way back at Western Washington. And I would get like the generic, hey, like, really talented, you're on your way, just keep working. And like, few sentences here and there, which I understand, they were really busy, and I've been in that position as well now. I understand how busy we can get and all that stuff, but it was just kind of like the generic advice. But John sent me back like, it was like a 9-paragraph email detailing every single part of my reel. And I was like, oh my goodness, like this is insane. So I'm reading it, and it's like literally like, you could tell that he like watched it like multiple times, because like he was outlining like, hey, at this part, maybe tweak this here, or really like that, or maybe like order it this way, this and that. And like I was like, wow, this is really impressive. So through that, we ended up building like this friendship and like a mentorship. And this is before I even got my job in Bend. And he's kind of helping me along the way, tweaking my reel, ends up helping me tweak my cover letter and my resume and all the stuff that I'm sending out to these news stations to try to help me get a job, because I went through an untraditional path, didn't really have the broadcast journalism program at my school. So I was already kind of, coming from an uphill battle a little bit per se. So he was able to kind of help me get through all of that stuff. And he also helped me get my job in Spokane, Washington. Like I stayed in touch with him during my time when I was working in Bend, and he was working in Spokane at the time. And one day he just kind of sent me a direct message on Twitter and said, hey man, I'm thinking about leaving the business, and I was wondering if you would want to come and take my job.
Wow.
And like just having that relationship and having that mentorship, it helped me get my job in Bend, and it also helped me get my job in Spokane. And he went on to become, he's actually now an adjunct professor over at Gonzaga University, and he teaches broadcast journalism. Yeah, he's the broadcast journalism professor over there. And I've spoken to his class a couple of times now too, to kind of pay it forward and stuff. But I told those kids when I talked to his class, I was like, you guys are so lucky to have him as your professor, because like he means the world to me. He opened doors to me, and like for you guys to be able to get this while you're in school, it's going to be so valuable going forward. That I was lucky enough to get it after I graduated and all that stuff, and build that relationship with him. But yeah, he is someone who I would definitely thank for how I got to where I am today, because without him, I don't go to Spokane, and without going to Spokane, I don't meet my fiance now, who I met in Spokane.
Wow.
Like it's really kind of crazy, like the doors that he opened for me, but I have him to thank most definitely. And then I'm getting a little long-winded here. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. And by the way, I think Collette is John Collette, right?
Yep, John Collette.
I think that's a really good example of, and you've mentioned this a couple times now, Femi, just putting yourself out there, putting your work out there. And this has come up on a lot of podcasts where you might try to get yeses from 100 people or responses from 100 people. It's okay if 98 say no, because the 2 yeses you get, the 1 or 2 yeses you get, might be the John Collette yes, who there's people out there that are going to take the time. They like your work. They want to see you succeed, even though they don't know you, and they take the time to do what they did. And I just think that's amazing, Femi, that you met your fiance and you basically got your jobs off a guy who quite randomly like stumbled upon you actively sending him something and decided to really speak to it and help you. Those people are out there. So as we wallow in all this negativity that we might see on social media or the different cable news outlets, like let's be real and level set here. There's a lot of positive people out there that are willing to help you, but you won't know that until you put your stuff out there.
Gotta ask
Femi,
first.
Yeah, you gotta ask first. Femi, that's number 2. Who's the third person?
The third person would be my current program director, John Goulet. So a couple Johns in there. But John Goulet is the program director here at VSiN. And when I was kind of not down in the dumps, but I was obviously on a little bit of hard times, having been laid off at Sinclair and Como. Luckily, though, I got laid off in March, like I mentioned. Man, it's a great time to be laid off because you just get to watch college basketball for an entire month and not have to worry about work. But he saw me just tweeting about college basketball, tweeting about betting and all that stuff. And luckily, like he just DM'd me and said, hey, man, like I see you tweet about betting. Like, are you interested in this? And he took a chance on me. Like, like people who take chances on me, I'm always indebted to. So it's kind of almost – I'm going to cheat here. John Goulet, then also Lee Anderson, my news director back in Bend, because both of them took chances on me when I hadn't really proved that I could hang in the industry. And
Yeah.
Lee was like the one that took a chance on me coming out of college. John took a chance on me because I'd never really hosted a radio show. I'd never done betting content, like in terms of like speaking into a microphone. I had written about betting columns when I was at Como because I'd kind of sort of been planting seeds here and there about I want to transition to betting content because I see where the industry is going after PASPA. So I had kind of been doing stuff already in Seattle, gearing up for that. And then it all came to a head after getting laid off, and John Goulet noticed it on Twitter and sent me a DM, and then they were gracious enough to have me come down for like an audition in May of 2021, did a few shows, and the shows went well, and kind of the rest is history. And now I'm here. I've been down here since July of 2021. So I have him to thank, and also Lee Anderson, my initial news director in Bend, Oregon, because none of this starts without him just saying, hey, man, have you ever heard of Bend, Oregon? You want to come down here? And I was like, I'll come down and interview. We'll see what happens. None of that. None of what I have now is even remotely close to being a possibility without Lee Anderson. So I'll do those two guys for the last person. I'll kind of cheat a little bit.
No, John Goulet, Lee Anderson. Like again, this goes back to, you mentioned their intuition in kind of plucking you away, but that's really a result of the work you put in and the preparation that you had, not just to get recognized, but to interview and impress upon, John and Lee that, hey, you are the guy for that. You are the person for this job. So again, I just, you deserve, I mean, this goes for all my guests. I just feel like you deserve a lot of credit for kind of carving out your own path and staying positive and kind of turning adversity into an opportunity. And so I knew, speaking of intuition, I knew you'd be a perfect guest for this. I honestly, I love your work. I think you're great on VSiN and anywhere else you've been, frankly. I appreciate that. And I'm just really happy to have had you on Sia Nejad Sports. Real quick before we let you go, how can people find you? You're on, we see it on the screen here, at Femi Abebefe. That's Abebefe. But in terms of VSiN and some of your content there and the GM Shuffle, can you just speak to that real quick so people know where to find your shows?
No, thank you for having me, man. This has been a lot of fun. And you can find me, like you mentioned, on Twitter at Femi Abebefe, but also the GM Shuffle podcast. You get it wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify. You guys know the whole deal by now, but episodes drop Mondays and Thursdays. So even though we're in the off season, we're going to 2 episodes per week. And obviously we're going to crank up once we get into the summertime and in the fall, once training camp and the season actually gets underway. That's when it really, really gets super fun. But GM Shuffle podcast, wherever you get your podcast. And then on VSiN, I host the Lombardi Line every Friday, and that is from 9 to 11 West Coast time, noon to 2 over on the East Coast. And then on Saturday, I host the Lombardi Line from 7 to 9 West Coast time, and that is 10 to noon on the East Coast. And then Sunday, we do Live Bet Sunday, myself and Jonathan Von Tobel, and that is from noon to 4 over on VSiN West Coast time, which is 3 to 7 on the East Coast. So those are the shows that I have at VSiN, in addition to doing the GM Shuffle Mondays and Thursdays. But man, this has been an awesome deal, Sia. I mean, I like everything that I do now is it's like about like media and sports and all that. But this has been like cool to kind of just talk things out and talk about like the other side of who we are. Cause I feel like oftentimes like we just get like, oh, you're on to talk about games. And it's like, which is cool. I love talking about games, but this is kind of a different side of that, which is I really appreciate it, man.
Well, I'll tell you what, thank you for saying that. Part of the problem with the moniker that I have, and it was somewhat purposeful because I knew we were going to sort of relate to sports here and there, but Sia Nejad Sports, it's kind of a misnomer, right? Because I'm not necessarily talking about sports. I mean, if people want to pursue a sports and a media career, that's great. But I actually want to talk to people who want to pursue any career and people who need to be motivated and create good habits. But to your point, I also want to have a platform where I can help people, and having you on the show, I think, and I've already gotten this sort of the private messages from just random people that have been helped by these shows. And I think this is another episode that's really going to help people kind of more than anything, put the work in and make sure they're not, and I hate to reduce this episode to this, but make sure they're not a paycheck person, and make sure that when that opportunity comes, that they're fully prepared to take advantage of it, because they have put the work in, not when people are watching necessarily, but when people are not watching, because that's what you got to do to really get to the place you want to be. And I'm glad I got to talk to you, Femi. It's been an hour. This flew by. We legitimately could have gone 3 hours, Femi.
Yeah, but honestly.
I'm not going to take any more of your time. You know where to find Femi. Definitely follow him on Twitter, and then you'll get access to all of the show content. And by the way, GM Shuffle, you got to put that in your repertoire. It's got a lot of personality and it's got a lot of knowledge that other shows, including shows that I'm on, just simply don't have. So thanks everybody for joining us on Sia Nejad Sports. Thank you to Femi Abebefe. My name is Sia Nejad. We will see you tomorrow with another episode. Thanks for watching.